It is no secret that one day we will all end our pilgrimage here upon this earth, that we're all going to die. And the Bible speaks of this fact in Hebrews 9:27, where it says, it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment. The question is going to be, when that day comes, when our appointment with death comes to us, what is our life going to be like here upon this earth? There's only going to be one thing that matters, and that is the same thing that mattered to Abraham. What kind of life did we live? Did we live a life that believed in God and showed that faith that we had in God through our works? Or did we live a kind of life that just ignored the existence of God? Did we live a life that trusted in the promises of God, the promised seed of God, that is Jesus Christ? Or did we live the kind of life where we just didn't believe in Jesus as the Son of God? Did we live the kind of life that followed after the promised land, that is, for us, the heavenly land? Or did we live a life that followed after its world, its possessions, its lights, its pride and its prestige and its pleasures? You know, did we live a life that followed God's plan and God's purpose for us? Or did we ignore God's plan and purpose for us in this life? The subject of the passage before us this morning is Genesis chapter 25. And this is a passage that deals with the end of Abraham's life, at least the first part of it, the first 10 verses, the close of his journey here upon this earth. It covers a period of about 35 years. That's the time from when Isaac married Rebekah to the death of Abraham himself. And you also read about, toward the latter end of that chapter, the life and the death of Ishmael. And basically it just shows how God fulfilled his promises to Abraham concerning Ishmael. But we want to look at Genesis 25 this morning with the view of how to prepare for death. And notice some things from the life of Abraham that he did that helped prepare him for death, and things that we can do too that will help prepare us for death. The first thing that I'll submit unto you that Abraham did that helped prepare him to die is that he delighted in his time here upon this earth. Notice verse 1 in Genesis 25. Then again, Abram took a wife, and her name was Keturah. Now, I'm not going to read the next 3 verses, all the names of Abraham's son and Abraham's grandsons. But we want to point out that Abraham was 140 years old at this point. And evidently he was a very lonely man. And Sarah had been dead now for about 3 years. And he felt the need for companionship. He didn't want to spend the last years of his life here upon this earth alone. And when you think about life, you know, there is indeed times when we look back on life and we regret certain things. We sorrow about certain things that have happened in our life, but the reality of it is, if we'll stop and consider it, there are also a lot of joys that have been brought to us in living this life here upon this earth too. And so you read about Abraham here, and he remarries. Again, he had the right to do that because Sarah had died, and to this woman that he remarried, 6 sons were born to Abraham. If you'll read through that list, probably the one that we're most famous with is the son that was named Midian. Later on, the Midianites, of course, would become his descendants. But there is certain joy that we should have in living our life here upon this earth. You know, we talked about in the beginning the reality of death. But that doesn't mean that God just wants us to sit around and wait for the inevitable to happen. There are things that he wants us to accomplish in this life, and there are joys that he has given us to experience too. And if we're going to be ready to die at the end of our life, we need to have a certain joy that came with living here upon this earth. In Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 9, the wise man said this: "Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life." You know, Abraham was a man who did that. He enjoyed his life here upon this earth with 2 wonderful women. Sarah during the first part of that life, and then later on in the latter part of his life, for about 35 years, he was married to Keturah. And the Bible told us when God created man in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2:15, he saw that it was not good for man to be alone. And so he created somebody to help have companionship with. He created woman in order for man to have somebody to share his life here with her upon this earth. And so the Bible teaches us that marriage is indeed a blessing. It's a joy that God has given us here upon this earth. And as Christians, we need to make the most of that. We need to enjoy the marriage that we have here upon this earth. We need to enjoy the time that we have with our husbands, with our wife, and we need to be sure that we have a certain joy that comes with living here upon this earth. Now, not only did Abraham delight to enjoy the blessings of marriage here upon this earth, but he was also blessed to enjoy children. In fact, remember the words of the psalmist in Psalm 127, beginning in verse 3. He said, "Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are the children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate." The Bible teaches us that children are a blessing from God. They're a joy to be enjoyed here upon this earth. And so Abraham enjoyed children. He enjoyed his time that he had with Ishmael in the beginning. He enjoyed this time that he had with Isaac. And I imagine later on in his life, as he remarried and he had 6 more sons, that he enjoyed his time with them too also. And as Christians, we need to enjoy the time that we have with our children here upon this earth. You know, it isn't the case, as some people think, that the Christian life is a life that is devoid of any joy, that doesn't have any happiness to come along with it. There are plenty of pleasures to be enjoyed in this life, and we need to be sure that we take time to delight in the life that we live here upon this earth. The third thing that I'll mention, it's not in the life of Abraham, but I do think it's worth mentioning, is a passage that's found in John 21 in verses 2 and 3. You'll read about how 7 of Jesus' disciples have gathered together, and this is after the death of Jesus. This is after the resurrection. And remember that Christ had told them to go to Jerusalem and wait until they had received power from on high, or the Holy Spirit. And I can just imagine these men, as they're sitting around, saying, "Well, what do you want to do?" And the other one says, "Well, I don't know. What do you want to do?" And if you'll notice in verse 3, Simon Peter, who was always one that was able to speak his mind and not shy to say what was on his mind, he says unto them, "I go a-fishing." They say unto him, "We also go with thee." They went forth and entered into a ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. Now, I know that probably somebody's going to say, "Well, wasn't that their occupation?" And indeed it was, but they were also waiting to receive this power. They were waiting to receive the ability to go out and fulfill the Great Commission that Christ had given to them. And so what are you going to do during that time? Well, do something that you enjoy. Do something that you know. And Peter says, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go fishing." And the other 6 disciples said, "Well, can we go along with you?" You know, there are things that God has given us in this life that we can enjoy. It's not a sin. It's not wrong to do so. And so there may be some recreation that you enjoy. It may be some hobby that's not sinful in nature, that is allowed by the Word of God that you enjoy. Take that time in life to enjoy those things. But we also need to say a word of caution, because not only do we need to enjoy those things, but we need to be sure at the same time that these things do not take priority in our life. You know, it's not wrong to have a spouse, a husband, or a wife if the law of God allows for us to do so. It's not wrong to have children. It's not wrong to enjoy recreation or hobbies. But we can't put those things before God. We can't allow them to take away our time from God or keep us from fulfilling God's plan or purpose for us here upon this earth. And so Abraham had a good life. He had joy in living his life here upon this earth. He never allowed those things to come before God, but indeed he did take some pleasure in his time here upon this earth. You know, it doesn't mean we don't long for a world that's better too. It doesn't mean that we don't look forward to heaven. But it does mean that we should take advantage of our joys. We shouldn't walk around sad-faced all the time. We shouldn't lament what we cannot alter. We shouldn't just sit and idly wait for the inevitable that we're going to die. Go and enjoy life and praise God for every day that he gives us here upon this earth. The second thing that I'll submit unto you that Abraham did, and we can do too, to help prepare us for death, is to take measures to divide our estate. Notice in verse 5 of Genesis 25, and Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, but unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country. It's interesting to note that Abraham divided his estate while he was still alive. And remember, when you think about the possessions of Abraham, Abraham was a very wealthy man. We read in Genesis 13 and verse 2 that Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And so he had a lot of livestock, he had a lot of silver, and he had a lot of gold. And remember, whenever Lot is taken captive from the city of Sodom, when Abraham sets out to recapture Lot and his family and his possessions, in Genesis 14:14, we read that when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Think about having having so many possessions that it takes 318 servants to take care of those possessions. Well, it tells us a little bit about how very rich Abraham was. Now, you may be thinking as we read through verses 5 and 6, well, why did Abraham divide his estate so lopsided? Why did he give Isaac all these gifts, and why did he give these other sons just a little bit, and why did he allow Isaac to stay there, and why did he send his other sons away? Well, understand that Abraham wasn't playing favorites at all. In fact, this was by divine decree. Remember back in Genesis chapter 21 and about verse 10, whenever Ishmael had mocked Isaac, Sarah wanted Ishmael and Hagar thrown out. And so in verse 10 of Genesis 21, wherefore she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman, and all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. God had clearly told Abraham that Isaac is going to be the promised son. He's going to be the one in whom thy seed is going to be called. And so Abraham's decision to give him all these things, it wasn't based upon his own prejudice, his own bias or favoritism toward his children. It was based upon the fact that God had said Isaac is the promised seed. And so it was by divine decree that Isaac was to be the chosen descendant of Abraham. And by the chosen descendant, I mean that the promised line was going to come through him. The promised nation, that is the Jewish nation, was going to come to him. And the promised seed, Jesus Christ, was going to be brought into the world through him. But it is interesting that before Abraham dies, he takes steps to divide up his estate. Well, why do you think that is the case? I don't know for sure that Abraham was trying to prevent any conflict within his family, but certainly those are some of the steps that we might think of in preparing for our death. If it comes to the end of our life and we haven't made a will, we haven't decreed what is to happen to our estate, have we been good stewards of the things that God has entrusted us with? I know some people will say, well, didn't Abraham's descendants fight over his estate anyway? Well, they did, but it wasn't due to anything that Abraham had done or lack of anything that Abraham had done. A person can still do everything within their power to prevent conflict over their estate after they die, and yet it's still up to those individuals who are involved to see or to carry that through. But Abraham did do everything within his power to try to prevent it. I'm reminded of the words of Abel in Hebrews 11 and verse 4. It says, by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. Our actions in this life can and do live on, and Abel is proof of that very thing. Now I know that the Hebrew writer's not talking about dividing up your estate, but he is talking about how the actions of Abel made a difference for generations to come. And so Abel was continuing to influence people even after he was gone. He was affecting his family for generations to come by his actions that he performed here upon this earth. And certainly we can do the same too. You know, it can be our actions or it can be a lack of our actions that actually influences others here upon this earth or continues to affect our family for generations to come. And so I think it's within our keeping to understand that the things that are given to us here upon this earth are gifts that have been given to us by God. And in the end, we're going to be accountable for those gifts. We're going to be accountable for how we handle those gifts. And so one of the things that we can help prepare to do before we die is make sure that we've made a will, make sure that we've divided our estate. And you see that here in the life of Abraham. The third thing that I'll submit unto you that we can do, and that Abraham did too, is keep a good demeanor toward death. Now, I know too often when we think about death and we study about it and we meet together because of it, we dwell on the negative side of death. And that's not to say that everything about death is positive. But there are certainly negative things that come along with death. One of them in the Bible that we read about in Acts 20, 37, and 38, all of us can relate to this, that when Paul spoke to the elders at Ephesus, they were crying, they were sorrowing because of the fact that they would see his face no more. That is one of the negative sides of death. But we also need to understand that there are positive things to think about when we think about death too. Notice in Genesis 25, beginning in verse 7, and these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived 115 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. The field which Abraham purchased of the sons of Heth, there was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife. Notice a few things about the description of Abraham's life or death that are positive in nature. The first thing the Bible talks about is that he had many days here upon this earth. He died in a good old age and an old man. Now, Abraham lived to be 175 years, and by today's standards, that would be almost a miracle. But even back then, that was a full life. That was a long life, a long time for a person here to live upon this earth. He lived for 100 years after he entered into the promised land. He lived for 75 years after the birth of his son Isaac. He lived for 38 years after the death of Sarah. He lived for 35 years after Isaac and Rebekah get married. And he lived for about the space of 15 years after his grandsons, Jacob and Esau, were born. The Bible tells us in Psalm 90 and verse 10 that the days of our years are 80 years and 10. And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. If you haven't ever done this, I would encourage you to do such. Sit down sometime and just add up the number of days that you've lived here upon this earth. You know, I'm 41 and about a half years old. I'm going to be 42 in August this year. And I sit down and begin adding up my days, and I've lived on this earth over 15,000 days. That's a long time by any means or any standard. Now, I know in our minds we can never live long enough, physically speaking, but also look at our life and understand we've had a good life. We've lived a long time here upon this earth. And if we're fortunate like Abraham to live long enough to get married and to have children and to see your children get married and then to experience the joys of grandchildren, you've had a good life. You know, the psalmist tells us here in Psalm 90 and verse 10 that 70 years is about the extent of the human body here upon this earth. God has designed our bodies in such a way that they're not going to last forever. So if you've lived, if you're alive and you've had 70 years here upon this earth, you've had a good life. You're lived to a good old age to be an older person, as Abraham was described here. So keep a good demeanor toward death. Don't feel like we've been cheated. Look at our life, number our days. Think about the joys that we've been able to experience here upon this earth. And if you're a Christian, remember that your life is being done right. That's one of the great joys of living here upon this earth and being prepared for death. In verse 8 of Genesis 25, it said of Abraham that he died in a good old age, an old man. And then there's this phrase, and full of years. Now that's an interesting phrase in the Hebrew language, because it literally means, it's the idea of being satisfied or living a fulfilled life. When you study the life of Abraham, Abraham had a hard life. He had a difficult life. We've talked about before the many trials that he had to face in this life. Sometimes he triumphed over those trials. Sometimes he crumbled, but he always turned back to God. And so as he looked back on his life, and as the Bible looks back on his life, Moses writing by inspiration here, he's saying he had a successful life. He had a fulfilled life, a triumphant life here upon this earth. And friends, if we've lived the Christian life, even if we've experienced, great trials, if we always turn back to God, then we've had a fulfilling life too. We can take satisfaction in the life that we've lived here upon this earth and say, you know what, I lived my life right. I lived it according to God's purpose or God's plan. The third thing that we can remember about death that can keep us or help us keep a positive attitude toward it is that we're going to be drawn to our people. It's interesting how the Bible describes death here in Genesis 25 and verse 8 for Abraham. The last part of the verse says, he was gathered to his people. Now, there's often been debate over what does that mean exactly. And if you read different commentators, you'll probably get different ideas of exactly what gathered to his people mean. But I want to point out a couple of things. The first thing is it could not mean that he was buried with his relatives or his family or his ancestors. How do I know that? Because in verse 9 we read that he was buried in the cave of Machpelah. And the only person, singular, that he could have been gathered to in the sense of being buried with them is Sarah. But the Bible said not that he was gathered to his person, but he was gathered to his people. And so I think that there's no doubt what the scripture is speaking of here is life after death. I think it's speaking of the fact that when Abraham died, his spirit was gathered to all those faithful people who lived before him. And yes, some of them would have included his family before. You remember the story of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16 and how the beggar Lazarus dies. And in verse 22, it says that he was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. Do you realize that when Lazarus died, he was gathered to his people? What does that mean? He was gathered to Abraham. He rested in Abraham's bosom. He was gathered to all those who lived their life faithfully to God, all those followers of God, those children of God before him. In Matthew chapter 8 and verse 11, Jesus said, I say unto you that many shall come from the east and the west and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. If we are a Christian, when we die, we are going to be gathered to our people. What does that mean? Well, just like Jesus said here, that means we're going to be gathered to great men like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And you think about some of the other greats in the Bible, about Moses and Elijah and David and Daniel and Peter and Paul and Jesus Christ. And you could just go on and on and on. But the point is that when we die, we're going to be gathered to our people. We're going to be gathered to those who had lived faithfully like us before. And so that's something to look forward to. That's something positive to think about whenever it comes to our death. The last thing that I'll mention about the death of Abraham that helped him to keep a good demeanor toward death, and can us too, is the case that death often brings our descendants closer. Notice in verse 9, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. You know, death just naturally has a way of bringing people closer. I know many times whenever we attend a funeral, you know, we'll run into somebody who we haven't seen maybe for years and years since we were children. And it's just a natural effect that death does indeed draw people closer. And what does that mean? Well, that means if there's a rift between two people, it gives them the opportunity to fix that. It gives them the opportunity to reconcile or to make amends. Now, I don't know that for sure that Isaac and Ishmael did that in the death of Abraham, but it is interesting as we read in verse 9 there that they buried their father together. And how many children can understand that, how the death of their mother or the death of their father has brought them closer to their siblings? You know, it is the case later on in life that you read about another reconciliation, and that is the sons of Abraham, Jacob and Esau. And part of what brings them together is the death of their father, Isaac. And so it is the case often that the death of a loved one, of a family member, draws us closer together, and it should. I think that's part of the way that God designed our life here upon this earth. And so you can take a little bit of comfort. Again, I know it doesn't erase all the negative things about death, but if you're trying to look for something positive, you know, you can take comfort in knowing that when you depart from this earth, it's going to bring your family closer together. You know, we've looked at the idea of death this morning, and of course, death is not my favorite Bible subject to preach upon, but it is a reality for us all. And so the question becomes, how can we prepare for death? And the answer is, follow the example that Abraham left before us. Delight in your time here upon this earth. You know, don't just sit around moping, waiting for the inevitable to come. Yes, death is going to come to us one day, but there's also a lot of joy to be had here upon this earth. Enjoy the blessings of a husband or a wife if you have the right to do so. Enjoy the blessing of children if you're able to have them. Enjoy the blessings of the joy that comes from enjoying the hobbies, the recreation, the nature of God here upon this earth. Again, don't put those things before God. Don't allow them to become the priority in your life or to take away the time that you have, the things that you should be doing for God. But in the same breath, understand that they're a blessing that God has given us to be enjoyed here upon this earth. Number 2, take measures to divide your estate. You know, one of the things that we can do, and we're supposed to do as Christians, is try to establish peace, not only between us and others, but between two other people. We're supposed to do everything that we can to work toward peace. Well, one of the ways that we can try to do that is that before we die, we've divided our estate. We've made out a will so that there's not going to be conflict whenever we die. Now, again, that doesn't always ensure that it's going to happen, but it does ensure that we've done everything within our power to try to make it happen. And then the third thing is keep a good demeanor toward death. Remember that you've had many days here upon this earth. You know, if you enjoy the blessing of marriage, or if you've had children, if you've had the ability to see them get married, if you're enjoying grandchildren, you've had a good life here upon this earth. You've reached a good old age. And so don't look at life as if you're being robbed by dying here upon this earth, but understand that you've lived a good life. That we also talked about the idea that your life is done right. You know, you can take satisfaction in looking back on your life if you're a Christian and say, I lived my life like God wanted me to live it, just like Abraham. I did what God purposed for me to do. I fulfilled God's plan for me here upon this earth. And then we talked about looking at what happens after death, or happens when we die, and that is we're going to be drawn to our people. We're going to be drawn, if we're a Christian, we're going to be going to live with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Daniel and David and all those great men and women that we read about in the Bible. And that certainly is a comforting thing to think about. And then take comfort in the fact that knowing death often brings our family or our descendants closer. It doesn't mean that there's nothing negative that comes with death itself, but it does often give an opportunity for people to draw closer to one another. And if we'll do all those things that Abraham did, then we'll be prepared to die just like he was.